Okay, so moving right along in part two, we're going to look at Edgar Allan Poe's The Fall of the House. A little bit of background on Poe just to understand who he was as a human being and a writer. He's very famous, but just in case you're not super familiar with him, he was one of the very first short story writers, one of the first literary critics, so one of the first people to philosophize about literature, its significance, how people should write it. One of the first horror writers and credited with inventing detective fiction. So he wasn't the very first horror writer, but the horror genre owes so much to him. He was literally the first writer to ever use a detective in one of his stories, directly anyway. And his 3 detective stories he wrote with the detective Dupin are kind of precursors to Sherlock Holmes. So he basically invented the detective genre. Again, not the first short story writer, but a pioneer of that important genre and one of the first literary critics. So lots of people throughout history are considered literary critics, but he was one of the first to directly recognize that he was putting forth his own philosophies about literature. And those philosophies are still influential today. He had a very difficult upbringing. His father abandoned the family when Poe was only 1 year old, and his mother died the next year. He had 2 people take him in and not officially adopt him, but raise him to adulthood and consider him to be one of their children. And he got along great with his adopted mother, but really quarreled and fought with his adopted father, which led to more complications. He attended the University of Virginia for a while. I think Poe would have done all right in college, but he didn't have enough money to continue. And because he and his adopted father did not get along, his adopted father cut off the funding, so he wasn't able to finish college, which led to him joining the military, the army, which was just, as I'm sure you can guess, not a good fit for Poe, and he did not last long. So after that, he turned to writing and tried to make a living solely as a writer. And he was one of the very first people to do that. He his stories and poems eventually became popular. His poem "The Raven" in 1845 was probably his most popular work. So he did earn some income that way, but to sustain himself, and not well, he was very poor all his life. He had to write a lot of reviews and articles for different newspapers and journals. So he was also known as a reviewer of other people's writing, most famously reviewing his friend Nathaniel Hawthorne's writing, and then the English author Charles Dickens reviewing Dickens' writing as well. But he became incredibly influential. Again, he basically invented short story writing, the horror genre, and the detective genre, and his literary theories have been incredibly influential. Works like The Raven or this work, The Fall of the House of Usher, are still some of the most famous poems and stories of all time. So his life was short and difficult, but he had an incredibly lasting impact. He lived in a number of different cities, including New York, Philadelphia, and Baltimore, where he died. In a museum in Philadelphia, there's a stuffed raven, which is actually the pet raven that belonged to Charles Dickens. He reviewed one of Charles Dickens' early novels, Barnaby Rudge, which featured a talking raven in 1841, and his reviews of that novel have become kind of famous because some of his literary theories can be found in those reviews of Dickens' novel, and reading that novel inspired him 4 years later to write his own poem about a talking raven, which was hugely popular. And Dickens had several ravens as pets, and ravens are like parrots. They can actually talk. And Dickens' pet raven became kind of famous, but when he was died, he had it stuffed to keep it. And it was so influential to Poe that it actually ended up in a museum in Philadelphia because of the influence on Poe rather than any museum or place connected to Dickens. So Poe was incredibly influential. Those are just some examples. But the end of his life, like the beginning, was really marked by tragedy. His wife and his adopted mother died just before him. He died in 1847. His wife died in he died in 1849. His wife died in 1847, and his adopted mother, whom he was actually close to compared to his adopted father, died right in there as well. And his relationship with his wife was complicated. She was his 13-year-old cousin. Back then, really until the end of the 19th century, the practice of marrying first cousins was still a common practice. It wasn't looked down upon the way it is now. Her age obviously was a complicating factor. I don't really know much about it. Many people think of Poe as just this crazy person. I think we're a little too harsh on him. In the brief bit I've studied his biography, I think she was very sickly, and I think he actually married her to give her some financial support and try to take care of her. And those were his main goals. But either way, he was, whatever we think of it, whatever we judge about him, there was no doubt he was very close to her, and her death deeply impacted him. Poems like The Raven and Annabel Lee and some of the others deal with the tragedy of losing a spouse. He struggled deeply with alcoholism at this time, and he finally died under very mysterious circumstances in Baltimore in 1849. I mean, there's been movies made about his death. People think it could have been suicide. It could have been related to his alcoholism. He was very sickly like his wife, so it could have been, natural medical causes. Some people even think he may have been murdered. There's no clear consensus. So his life was as strange as his work, but the impact, the influence, the importance of his work cannot be overlooked. Let's study that. Like with each text, we're going to look at some main themes or threads, things that recur throughout the text we can pull on. So we'll list those here. On the next slides, we'll look at language from the text to see what shakes out. And on the final slides, we'll look at some discussion questions that can help bring your study of these ideas full circle. Characterization is super important. You have the narrator, Roderick Usher, Madeline Usher. Each of these characters and how they're described is really important to understanding the story, so we'll actually look at detailed descriptions of them. Setting and tone are incredibly important. I use Poe in classes where I teach setting and tone. The house, you could argue, is a fourth character here, and these characterizations set the tone of the story. It's essentially part of the horror genre. Like I said, Poe helped found the horror genre. So you need tone for a good horror story. The poetry of prose. I say that kind of ironically because Poe really theorized about the differences between poetry and fiction or prose. Prose and fiction are synonyms, and the differences of what a writer could do with each one and their purposes. He saw the purpose of poetry being beauty and the purpose of prose being truth. But the language in all of Poe's writings, or almost all of them, is very beautiful. And I think particularly in this story. And you have this song that appears early on. And that was actually a poem he published separately as well called The Haunted Palace. And so that the fact that he intermixes poetry into the fiction here is really interesting. And it relates to my next point, which is the irony. The beauty of the language and structure of the story versus the insanity and decline of the Ushers. I talked before about how Poe, because he married his cousin, struggled with alcoholism, got kicked out of the army. He has this reputation of being just like this crazy guy. But that is misguided because when you look at his literary works, the structure is meticulous. Whatever was going on in his personal life, this is a guy who could write in a way that was methodical and intentional, and the structure of this text and the beauty of its language really contrasts the insanity of Roderick and Madeline Usher. And so that's a really interesting use of irony. And so threads 3 and 4 here are related, right? If the language is beautiful, the structure is beautiful, it does not seem like a madman wrote this, but it's depicting a madman, Roderick Usher. So the structure is incredibly important here. It's very strategic how the narrator approaches the house, how he meets Roderick, the early interactions with Madeline. It builds and it builds, eventually bearing her to the revelation that she's still alive, and then the narrator getting out as the house crumbles. That is all, those 5 or 6 steps there, they all build on each other in a way that the suspense builds and builds, so you have this really intense thriller of a story, with this conclusion where everything comes full circle. So the structure is very meticulous and intentional and leads to the effect of the story on the reader. None of that would be possible without this structure. And then you have 2 levels on which the story is operating. I call this parallelism. So physical space is very important. And so you have the decline of the house, right? It literally sinks into the ground, matches the decline of the family. As Roderick and Madeline are the last of their family line and they're gone now, the house also is gone. And so again, this is another thing that can only be achieved by a writer who is really in full command of his craft and shows how the story operates on multiple levels at the same time. Finally, literary versus genre fiction. We think of literary fiction as the great books, the canonical works, Dickens, Shakespeare, Homer, etc., and genre fiction as detective fiction, science fiction, horror fiction, westerns. And most scholars think genre fiction shouldn't really be studied in schools, and literary fiction is most important. But Poe really blends those two, because I don't think any scholar would say that The Fall of the House of Usher should not be part of the literary canon, but it's clearly a horror story. It's clearly part of that genre. And so I think with Poe, we can see how genre fiction, things that others tend to dismiss, like detective fiction or horror fiction, may actually have a place in the classrooms. That's what I would argue, but I'll be very curious on the discussion board to see what you think. Threads, the things we're going to study. Let's start with characterization. So let's look at a description of Roderick Usher and what stands out as significant in this description. Again, you can always pause the lecture and think about the question, before I give my response. We sat down, and for some moments, while he spoke not, I gazed upon him with a feeling half of pity, half of awe. Surely, man had never before so terribly altered in so brief a period as had Roderick Usher. It was with difficulty that I could bring myself to admit the identity of the wan being before me with the companion of my early boyhood, that the character of his face had been at all times remarkable. The now ghastly pallor of the skin and the now miraculous luster of the eye, above all things, startled and even awed me. The silken hair, too, had been suffered to grow all unheeded, and as, in its wild gossamer texture, it floated rather than fell about the face, I could not, even with effort, connect its arabesque expression with any idea of simple humanity. So, if we were in a classroom right now, I would love to hear your reactions to this passage and write them on the whiteboard and use them as a catalyst to launch us into what would undoubtedly be a great discussion of Roderick Usher. But we have to work with what we have. So we're online, so we'll see how what you jotted down to this question match what stood out to me. And you can deduce all kinds of interesting things from those connections. But what stood out to me is that Roderick has changed since the narrator knew him as a young boy. He's changed to a point where he no longer resembles something human. He's like become non-human. So those are the 2 things that stand out to me. And you see how he's incredibly pale, how his hair is like outflowing above his head. And you have here a really powerful description. But it's important to note that this is not the same man as before, and he's become less human. Moving along, I'd like to also look at a passage describing the house. That was the first passage describing Usher, And this next passage is the very first two sentences. Poe has incredibly long sentences of the story, and it describes the house. I talked about before how the house is almost like a character, and how the fall of the family parallels the fall of the house. So we can use our description of the character, Usher, to compare to the description of the house, also called Usher. Here's the first few sentences of the story. During the whole of a dull, dark, and soundless day in the autumn of the year, when the clouds hung oppressively low in the heavens, I had been passing alone, on horseback, through a singularly dreary tract of country, and at length found myself, as the shades of the evening drew on, within view of the melancholy house of Usher. I know not how it was, but, with the first glimpse of the building, a sense of unsufferable gloom pervaded my spirit. I say unsufferable, for the feeling was unrelieved by any of that half-pleasurable, because poetic, sentiment, with which the mind usually receives even the sternest natural images of the desolate or terrible. I looked upon the scene before me, upon the mere house, and the simple landscape features of the domain, upon the bleak walls, upon the vacant eye-like windows, upon a few rank sedges, and upon a few white trunks of decayed trees, with an utter depression of soul which I can compare to no earthly sensation more properly than to the after-dream of the reveller upon opium, the bitter lapse into everyday life, the hideous dropping off of the veil. Really interesting characterization here. It comes back to that idea I mentioned in the threads of beauty versus what's actually happening in the text. I want to use a few examples here. If you just study language and separate it from meaning, some words are beautiful. A lot of you probably know what placenta is. This is an illustration. Placenta, comes out when a mother gives birth. It's not really a pretty image. But the word placenta is a beautiful sounding word. And so there's been a trend lately, or it started about 10 years ago. I don't know if it's still going on. But when my wife and I were first having kids, it was going on of women actually naming their babies placenta because they heard the word placenta while they're in the hospital, thought it sounded beautiful, not knowing what it actually was, decided to name their children that. That's an illustration of what's going on here. If we don't think about what the words mean, the words themselves just sound beautiful. They sound like poetry. That's how beautiful they are, even though this is fiction. So what Poe is depicting here is really gloomy and bleak, but the language to describe it is beautiful. And so between the sound of the words and their meaning, you have a disconnect, and that leads to irony. Irony makes the writing more powerful. Poe even alludes to this. He says, the image of the house of Usher is insufferable, but he says, meaning unable to suffer. So I say insufferable, for the feeling was unrelieved by any of that half-pleasurable because poetic sentiment with which the mind usually receives even the sternest natural images of the desolate or terrible. So Poe is saying that something even desolate or terrible sometimes is tolerable or sufferable because there's something poetic, there's something beautiful about it. He's saying the house of Usher, just looking at the house, is so desolate and terrible that there's no poetry in it. Yet these words are very poetic. So this language here is operating on several levels. The other thing we see is a connection to Usher, the man. The man and the house are connected. If we look at this passage in comparison to the one I just read on the previous slide, we see that they are both in decline, not as they once were, not in a good place. I'd like to wrap up our study of the language of the text here and the pulling on the threads by juxtaposing the very first paragraph with the very final paragraph. And we've talked a lot about how the fall of the house parallels the fall of the family. Let's look at the final passage to see that play out. From that chamber and from that mansion I fled aghast. The storm was still abroad in all its wrath, as I found myself crossing the old causeway. Suddenly there shot along the path a wild light, and I turned to see whence a gleam so unusual could have issued. For the vast house and its shadows were alone behind me. The radiance was that of the full setting and blood-red moon, which now shone vividly through that once barely discernible fissure, of which I have before spoken, as extending from the roof of the building in a zigzag direction to the base. While I gazed, this fissure rapidly widened. There came a fierce breath of the whirlwind. The entire orb of the satellite burst at once upon my sight. My brain reeled as I saw the mighty walls rushing asunder. There was a long, tumultuous shouting sound like the voice of 1,000 waters, and the deep and dank tarn at my feet closed suddenly and silently over the fragments of the house of Usher. So we've seen Madeline still alive, and the full insanity of Roderick is shown there. The house starts collapsing. The narrator's like, I gotta get out. This is what he sees as he briefly looks back as he's riding away. He sees the walls crumbling. He sees the earth actually swallow the house, presumably with Roderick and Madeline inside. So you have the end of the house of Usher, the physical building, and the end of the house of Usher, the fall of the family. And I just come back to the language. I just love reading this passage. It's horrific what happens, but the language is so beautiful, just like the last one, that I could read this over and over again. So there's a lot of implications here. Why does the family fall? There's certainly no progress. We talked about in part one how progress can be a bad thing. There's always consequences. But no progress is also not an option. And so the families become static. There's even the hint of incest or inbreeding could have been going on between Roderick and Madeline. That's not a process to further the line. And so you eventually have the collapse. And so this story also deals with things like stasis, a lack of progress. But the question of why the family line ends is one well worth pursuing that you can pursue on the discussion board. And so what other questions can you take on the discussion board? I think first thing to consider would be this story is so similar to the Signal Man that comparing the two would be really fruitful. So I'm going to point out some of those similarities and then kind of challenge you to go further on the discussion board. What similarities and differences do you see between the Signal Man and the fall of the House of Usher? They're both fairly gothic stories. House of Usher is more gothic, but there's some gothic elements in the Signal Man, the ghosts, and the description of his home. From the middle of the 19th century, published around the same time, 1840s, 1860s, that combine elements of realism with the supernatural. We talked about reality and unreality in the Signal Man. Here, there's more supernatural in the fall of the House of Usher, but still, it's fairly realistic. It's not like 30 zombies are chasing the guy and he's just mowing them down with a gun. There's some stuff that's not really fully explainable. Is Madeline alive or dead? How does the house just fall onto the earth, etc.? But compared to other stories from the horror genre, it's fairly realistic. So you've got quasi-Gothic stories from the middle of the 19th century that are both supernatural and realistic. They both involve a relatively sane narrator. He seems pretty sane, although we can't be completely sure of that, but relatively sane, meeting with a man who has lived in isolation in a unique physical space that impacts the narrative. And most importantly, this man is slowly going insane. So when you lay the elements out like that, they're clearly very similar. And I mentioned how Poe and Dickens were friends, and they wrote back and forth to each other and influenced each other. And Poe is one of the most famous fiction writers in the US in the 19th century, and Dickens was the most famous novelist in England in the 19th century, so just a lot in common. But let's go beyond these basic commonalities. Why are these connections significant? What differences do you see? Because undoubtedly there are some. And what does the fall of Usher teach us, particularly back to our big learning question, the importance of human interaction? How is maybe what it teaches us different from the Signal Man? Because another really important point of comparison here is they both involve a relatively sane man coming to speaking with a man who's slowly going insane. In one case, they're old friends. In another case, they're becoming friends. But these conversations are very important. In both cases, we see how conversation and interaction with another human being can be helpful. We see how it kind of enlivens Usher for a little bit. But ultimately, the conversations that take place aren't enough to preserve the sane man. The insane man, is still lost. And so there's a lot here about the importance of human interaction. I really am looking forward to hearing what you have to say about it. Another interesting thing to pursue would be irony. So you'll have a scene, for instance, and you can look at what the characters are saying, what the narrator is saying. How is that maybe different from what the message Poe is trying to convey? Like an example of this would be looking at the beauty of the opening passage, but ironically, what it conveys, the meaning of those beautiful sounding words, is not beautiful at all. It's desolate and bleak. So what are some other examples like that, ones you could analyze that show irony? And you can continue to consider this idea of the beautiful language juxtaposed with what the horror of what's actually happening, or you can look at some other contradiction. And something to think about here is, how is irony, because he could just say the house is desolate, but how is saying the house is desolate through beautiful words maybe more impactful, more powerful, more influential than just saying the house is beautiful?